The night fell heavily over New York, bringing with it a biting cold that spread through the wet streets. The neon sign lights reflected in the puddles, dancing to the rhythm of the icy wind sweeping across the nearly empty sidewalks. The distant sound of horns and sirens mixed with the murmur of the light rain, creating a melancholic urban symphony. Ethan Caldwell pulled his dark overcoat tighter around his body and shoved his hands into his pockets. He was exhausted. After another long day at the office, he had decided to walk to his apartment, trying to clear his mind before facing another lonely night in his pristine, silent loft. He walked unhurriedly, observing the distorted reflections of the city on the rain-soaked streets. He hadn't noticed the man huddled under the awning of a closed coffee shop, not until a strange shiver ran down his spine, an unease that made him slow his pace. Something about that miserable figure seemed familiar. Ethan stopped a few feet away, hesitant. The man was sitting on the ground, curled up against the red brick wall, arms crossed over his chest in a futile attempt to keep warm. His unkempt beard hid part of his face, and his dirty hair fell in disheveled strands over his half-closed eyes. His clothes, filthy and torn, barely shielded him from the piercing cold of the night. Feeling a mix of pity and unease, Ethan stepped closer and took off his own coat, holding it out to the stranger. "Here, this will help with the cold." The man slowly lifted his head, as if every movement required immense effort. His deep, weary eyes met Ethan's for an instant, and then something happened. A shock ran down the millionaire's spine, an impossible-to-ignore sensation. Those eyes, even beneath the grime and exhaustion, there was something in them that hit him like a punch to the gut. A distant memory, a long-lost connection. "Take it," Ethan insisted, trying to ignore the lump forming in his throat. The man blinked a few times, his eyes clouded with distrust. He took the coat with trembling fingers, pulling it over himself as if doubting his own luck. Then, in a hoarse and almost imperceptible voice, he murmured, "Thank you." Ethan was still frozen, analyzing every detail of the dirty, gaunt face before him. He knew this man. He had to know him. But before he could say anything, the stranger averted his gaze, curling up against the wall again, as if wanting to disappear. Ethan hesitated. His heart pounded in his chest. Was his mind playing tricks on him? Could it really be? The rain grew heavier, drenching his expensive clothes, but he didn't move. He couldn't. Then, finally, he forced himself to take a step back, then another. But as he walked away, the cold and unease gnawing at his peace, only one certainty filled his mind. That man was Jonathan. His brother was alive. Ethan Caldwell opened the door to his apartment and tossed the keys onto the glass table. The loft was spacious, modern, with enormous windows revealing the illuminated city, but everything there felt empty, cold. He ran his hands over his face, trying to shake off the unrest growing inside him. He took off his wet overcoat and threw it over a chair. Walking to the bar, he grabbed a glass and poured himself some whiskey. The golden liquid burned as it slid down his throat, but it brought no relief. The scene in the street wouldn't leave his mind. That man, those eyes. He stepped onto the balcony, watching the lights of New York flicker in the distance. Down below, life carried on at its usual frantic pace, indifferent to the storm brewing inside him. Could it really be Jonathan, the brother who vanished without a trace, who left a hole in the family, tearing apart what was left of it? The brother he had believed to be dead, if it was true. Where had he been all these years? How had he ended up on the streets? And most of all, why had he never come back? Ethan closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long while, let the memories flood in. There was a time when Ethan and Jonathan were inseparable. They grew up in a modest but lively home. Jonathan, 7 years older, had always been his hero, smart, funny, protective. Ethan remembered afternoons in the backyard, where Jonathan taught him how to kick a ball, the nights he read him stories before bed, using silly voices to make him laugh. He remembered the scent of coffee and books in the living room, where Jonathan studied to become a teacher. He made it. He became a brilliant academic, married Emily, a kind and vibrant woman. Together, they had a daughter, Lily. Then, the accident happened. Emily and Lily were driving home on a rainy night. A truck ran a red light. Jonathan was never the same. He stopped teaching, stopped talking, and one day he simply disappeared. Their mother waited and waited until the waiting turned into sickness, and the sickness took her life. Ethan was left alone. He buried himself in work, built his fortune, but never managed to erase that part of his history. Now, years later, a homeless man with familiar eyes had reappeared in his life, dragging back everything he had tried to forget. Ethan opened his eyes. He looked at the clock, 3:17 a.m. He ran a hand over his face and let out a heavy sigh. I was mistaken, he thought. It has to be just a coincidence. But deep down, he didn't believe that. What would he do if he was right? If that man really was his brother? The answer came before he even realized it. I need to go back there. I can't let him disappear again. It's him. It has to be him. And deep down, he knew he wouldn't rest until he was certain. The cold of the New York morning cut like a blade as Ethan walked through the streets, still damp from the night before. The gray sky and the smell of wet pavement seemed to match his mood, confused, heavy, restless. The image of that man, huddled against the brick wall of the coffee shop, wouldn't leave his mind. Even after spending the night trying to rationalize it, searching for all possible logical explanations, the truth still haunted him. It was Jonathan. His eyes. No matter how many years had passed, no matter the scruffy beard or the deep lines of exhaustion on his face, Ethan would recognize those eyes anywhere. The doubt, however, remained. How had his brother, a brilliant man, a respected professor, become homeless? What had happened all these years? And most of all, why had he never come back? With every step toward the coffee shop, Ethan's anxiety grew. He didn't know what to say, how to approach the situation. If it really was Jonathan, and everything pointed to that, he was right there, so close. After years of believing his brother was dead, he had found him by chance, in the rain, like just another stranger. Could a connection lost for so long be rebuilt? The coffee shop was on the corner of a busy street. The scent of fresh coffee and warm bread drifted through the glass doors, inviting and familiar. Ethan crossed the street and stopped on the other side, watching. And there he was, sitting in the same spot as the night before, his body curled as if trying to disappear from the world. The coat Ethan had given him was draped over his shoulders, but the trembling in his hands betrayed the fact that the cold still reached him. Ethan took a deep breath. He couldn't just walk away, not this time. "Hey," he called, stepping closer. The man slowly lifted his head. His tired, wary eyes met Ethan's. The confirmation hit the millionaire hard. It was him, but Johnny, or Jonathan, only stared at him for a moment before looking away, as if he had already accepted that life had nothing left for him but solitude. Ethan didn't let the silence stretch on. "Do you want a coffee?" The question came out casually, but it carried a much deeper meaning. He was offering more than a warm drink. He was offering a moment, an opportunity to reconnect. Johnny hesitated. His eyes wandered down the street, as if considering the possibility of simply getting up and disappearing. But in the end, he just nodded slightly. Without another word, Ethan opened the coffee shop door and waited. After a moment of hesitation, Johnny stepped inside. The smell of hot coffee and freshly baked bread stirred something deep inside Ethan. A memory invaded his mind without warning. He was a child, no older than 6. Jonathan, then a teenager, had taken him to a small diner after school. It was one of those old-fashioned diners, with red booths and a polished wooden counter. "You always order pancakes with strawberry syrup," Jonathan said, laughing. "One day you're going to get tired of them." Ethan shook his head vigorously. "Never." Jonathan chuckled and ruffled his hair. "We'll see." Ethan blinked, and the memory faded, but its weight remained. He pulled out a chair and sat at the table. Johnny did the same, but his eyes avoided Ethan's. The waiter approached, and Ethan ordered 2 coffees and some toast. Johnny remained silent, his nervous fingers playing with the edge of the napkin on the table. The silence was heavy. Johnny was the first to break it. "Why are you doing this?" Ethan lifted his gaze, meeting his. "Because I want to." Johnny let out a humorless laugh. "You don't even know me." Ethan felt his heart tighten. "Maybe I do." Johnny's gaze grew distant, lost in something Ethan couldn't see. He picked up the coffee cup, holding it between his hands as if trying to absorb its warmth. "I used to be a teacher," he murmured. "Literature." Ethan froze. There was the confirmation he didn't want to hear, and yet so desperately needed. It was him. Johnny didn't seem to realize the impact of his words. He just kept turning the cup in his hands, as if lost in another time. Ethan felt a lump in his throat. He had to ask. "Jonathan?" Johnny blinked. Time seemed to stop. "Jonathan?" Caldwell? The man's breath caught in his throat. His eyes widened, and the cup in his hand trembled, causing a bit of coffee to spill onto the saucer. The silence between them became deafening. Then suddenly Johnny stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. I have to go," he said, his voice hoarse and hurried. Ethan stood up as well. "Wait." But Johnny was already leaving. Without looking back, he walked across the coffee shop, stepped out the door, and vanished into the crowd. Ethan remained standing, speechless, feeling the world spin around him. He had found him. His brother was alive. But now, he had to figure out why Jonathan never came home. And one thing was certain, he wasn't going to give up. Ethan stood frozen in the middle of the coffee shop, the sounds around him muffled by the avalanche of thoughts. Johnny had disappeared as quickly as he had arrived, fleeing as if his very identity was a threat. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, trying to piece everything together. It was him. There was no doubt anymore. His brother was alive, so why did he run? He paid the bill and rushed outside, his eyes scanning the street in an attempt to find him. But Jonathan was already gone. A storm of emotions consumed him. Anger, sadness, confusion. Jonathan was his older brother, the man who had always been by his side when they were kids, the brilliant professor who taught with passion. How could he just erase his life and become a ghost? Ethan knew he couldn't move forward without answers, and he wasn't going to wait any longer to find them. Back in his apartment, Ethan sat in front of his computer and typed a name he hadn't spoken in years. Jonathan Caldwell. The results appeared quickly. There was little recent information, no updates, no new photos, just old articles about his work as a professor and the news of his disappearance years ago. Ethan felt his stomach turn. He saw Jonathan's photo again, taken on the day of his last lecture. He was wearing a navy blue suit, his hair slightly tousled as always, but his eyes were full of life. Nothing like the broken man Ethan had seen on that sidewalk. He kept searching. He found old records from the university where Jonathan had taught, photos from academic awards, mentions of research on classical literature, and then, further down, an old news article. Professor loses wife and daughter in tragic accident. The article detailed the accident. Emily and Lily were on their way home when a truck hit them at an intersection. They died instantly. Jonathan, who was teaching at the time, received the news while still on campus. After that, he was never the same. The article spoke of his attempt to keep working, his struggle to cope with the loss, but a few months later he requested a leave of absence from the university. No one knew exactly what happened after that. He simply disappeared. Ethan closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. Now he understood. Jonathan hadn't run away because he wanted to. He ran because he could no longer exist in a world where he had lost everything. But what he didn't realize was that by disappearing, he had also destroyed what was left of their family. Ethan opened his eyes, determination growing inside him. He had to find Jonathan, and this time, he wouldn't let him run. Ethan returned to the coffee shop that same night. He knew Jonathan had no home. The only place he could look for him was there. A light drizzle made the asphalt glisten under the streetlights. He leaned against a nearby building, arms crossed. Time passed slowly. People came and went, but Jonathan didn't appear. With each passing minute, Ethan felt his frustration grow. What if he never came back? But then, after almost 2 hours, he saw him. Jonathan walked slowly down the sidewalk, his body hunched against the cold wind. His steps were sluggish, as if each one required immense effort. He passed by the coffee shop, glanced inside briefly, and then headed toward the alley next to it. Ethan didn't think twice. "Jonathan!" His brother froze. "Don't run this time." Jonathan took a deep breath but didn't turn around. Ethan walked toward him, stopping just a few steps away. "Why did you run this morning?" Jonathan remained still. After a long silence, his voice came out hoarse. "I'm not that guy anymore, Ethan." Ethan felt a knot in his chest. "You can try to convince yourself of that, but I know it's not true." Jonathan finally turned around, his eyes filled with something between sadness and guilt. "You don't understand." Ethan stepped closer. "Then make me understand." Jonathan lowered his head. "I'm a ghost." "That's bullshit." "It's not." Jonathan's voice rose, his eyes burning with anger and pain. "You have no idea what it's like to lose everything, to lose your wife, your daughter, and know that nothing you do can ever bring them back." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. You weren't alone, Jonathan. His brother let out a bitter laugh. I wasn't. Then why do I only see emptiness when I look back? Ethan felt his own anger rising. You want to know what was left behind? He took a step forward, his eyes locked on Jonathan's face. A mother who waited for you until her last breath. Jonathan blinked, confused. What? Ethan felt the pain surge inside him. Our mother died waiting for you to come back. Jonathan's face lost all color. He stumbled backward, leaning against the wall as if his legs could no longer support him. No. Yes. She never accepted your absence, Jonathan. She waited for years. And when she realized you weren't coming back, it killed her. Jonathan ran a trembling hand through his messy hair. No. Tears welled up in his eyes. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the ground, his elbows resting on his knees, his head hanging low. Ethan felt his chest tighten. Seeing him like this was painful, but he needed to hear the truth. He crouched beside his brother. You didn't kill our mother. She died from heartbreak, but now you're here, you can start over. Jonathan didn't answer. He just sat there, trembling, his eyes fixed on the wet pavement. Ethan sighed and pulled an envelope from his pocket. There's enough money in here for you to get off the streets. I can help you, but only if you want it. Jonathan remained still. Ethan didn't push him. He simply placed the envelope beside him and stood up. I'm not giving up on you, but now the choice is yours. And without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Jonathan alone with his past. Jonathan remained there, sitting on the wet sidewalk, as Ethan's footsteps faded into the darkness of the street. The envelope beside him felt as heavy as 1,000 bricks. The cold of the early morning seeped into his bones, but he didn't move. His mind spun, trying to process everything he had just heard. His mother was dead, not because of old age or illness, but because he never came back. Jonathan clenched his fists. He felt bile rise in his throat. For years he had convinced himself that disappearing was the right thing to do, that his presence in the world would only bring pain. But now he wasn't so sure. His eyes fell on the envelope. Money. Enough for a hot meal, maybe a room for a few nights. He reached out a trembling hand, hesitated for a moment, then finally picked it up. In that moment, something shifted inside him. Maybe, just maybe, he still had a choice. Jonathan walked through the city, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his head down. Every step felt like a burden. He avoided people's gazes, afraid that somehow they could see right through him. After a while, he found a simple hotel, the kind that didn't ask questions. He stepped inside, feeling the weight of the rain on his clothes. The receptionist eyed him warily, but when Jonathan pulled out some bills from the envelope, the man simply nodded and handed him a key. Room 212. Jonathan climbed the stairs slowly. Each step creaked, as if doubting he should be there. When he reached the room, he closed the door behind him and looked around. The room was small, simple. A single bed, a tiny bathroom, a yellowed bedside lamp. But for Jonathan, after years of sleeping on the cold streets, it felt like a palace. He sat on the bed, feeling the mattress sink beneath his weight. His fingers ran over the rough bedspread, as if he needed to confirm that it was real. Then, without warning, he broke down in tears. He couldn't remember the last time he cried. But now, alone in that cramped room, he couldn't hold it in anymore. The images came like a flood. Emily smiling at the front door. Lily running through the yard with her arms outstretched, calling for him. The phone ringing in the middle of class. The cold voice of the nurse saying they were gone. And then, the emptiness. Jonathan squeezed his eyes shut and took a deep breath. He could still feel the pain. He could still remember the day he left everything behind. But now, for the first time in years, he didn't want to disappear. The next morning, a soft knock on the door woke him. Jonathan sat up slowly, blinking against the sunlight streaming through the cracks in the curtain. Jonathan! The voice on the other side was firm but not angry. Jonathan closed his eyes. Ethan. He was tempted not to answer, to pretend he wasn't there, but he knew his brother wouldn't leave so easily. So, he got up, ran a hand over his face, and opened the door. Ethan stood there holding a paper bag in one hand and a cup of hot coffee in the other. I brought breakfast. Jonathan stared at him for a moment, then sighed and stepped aside, letting him in. Ethan set the bag down on the table and sat in the room's only chair. Jonathan sat on the bed watching his brother. It was strange. After all these years, here they were, sharing the same space again. Ethan opened the bag and pushed a container toward him. Pancakes with strawberry syrup. Jonathan froze. For a moment he wasn't in that room. He was 13 years old, sitting next to a small, excited Ethan in a diner. You always order pancakes with strawberry syrup. One day you're going to get tired of them. Jonathan blinked and returned to the present. His eyes met Ethan's, and in that gaze, he saw something he hadn't expected. Hope. They ate in silence. Jonathan's stomach tightened as he accepted the warmth of the food after so long. When they finished, Ethan pulled something from his backpack. A book. Jonathan frowned as Ethan placed it on the table. You wrote this. Jonathan stared at the book in disbelief. He recognized the title. It was a book he had written years ago, back when he was still teaching. A study on the influence of tragedy in literature. He hadn't seen that book in years. Thought you might want to see it, Ethan said, leaning back in his chair. Jonathan ran his fingers over the cover. Seeing his own name printed there felt like it belonged to someone else. He swallowed hard. Why are you doing this? Ethan sighed. Because you're my brother, and I don't want to lose you again. Jonathan looked away, pressing his lips together. I don't know if I can come back. Ethan nodded. No one said it would be easy, but I know you still have something to give to the world, Jonathan. Jonathan stared at the book for a long time. Deep inside, he felt a spark, something he hadn't felt in years. Ethan stood up, grabbed his backpack, and walked to the door. I already paid for this room for the whole week. You decide what happens after that. He looked at his brother, waiting for a reaction. Jonathan just nodded. Ethan sighed and opened the door. Before leaving, he turned one last time. Think about it. And then, he was gone. Jonathan sat alone in the room, the scent of coffee still lingering in the air, the book in his hands, and for the first time in a long time he thought about the possibility of starting over. Jonathan woke up to the sunlight filtering through the hotel room curtains. The soft glow reflected off the pale walls, a stark contrast to the darkness he had lived in for the past few years. For a moment he didn't know where he was. His body tensed, conditioned to waking up on the cold concrete, hunger gnawing at his stomach, with the sounds of the city as his only alarm. But then he felt the mattress beneath him, the faint scent of coffee still in the air. The memory of the night before returned like a wave. His eyes landed on the book on the table. He hesitated before picking it up, as if afraid that all of this was just a dream, but it wasn't. He ran his fingers over the cover, feeling its familiar texture. It was real, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. The silence in the room was interrupted by the ringing of a phone. Jonathan flinched. He hadn't owned a phone in years. Seconds later, a knock at the door. He hesitated before opening it. Ethan stood there, holding a cup of coffee, his expression a mix of relief and urgency. Good morning. Jonathan blinked, confused. I wasn't expecting to see you so soon. Neither was I. Ethan sighed and held out the coffee. But I think you'll want to hear this. Jonathan took the cup without a word. Ethan stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Have you seen the news? Jonathan frowned. News? Ethan pulled out his phone and opened a news site. Jonathan's name was right there. Former professor found after years living on the streets. Jonathan's stomach twisted. Below the headline, there was an old photo of him at the university, alongside a recent image, one taken by some anonymous bystander. He recognized the moment. It was from the night before when he had hurried out of the coffee shop. His chest tightened. How? Someone saw us yesterday. They recorded a video, posted it online. Jonathan looked at Ethan, at a loss for words. This isn't good. Depends on how you look at it. Ethan scrolled down and showed him another article. University reaches out to former professor after heartwarming story goes viral. Jonathan felt the air leave his lungs. What? They want to talk to you. Ethan crossed his arms. They said they never forgot your contributions to academia. They're offering you an opportunity. Jonathan let out a weak, disbelieving laugh. This has to be a joke. It's not. Jonathan ran a hand over his face. The weight of it all hit him like a punch. For years he had lived believing he was a ghost, that no one cared about him anymore, that his name had been erased from the world. And now, out of nowhere, they were offering him a chance to return. Jonathan stood and walked over to the dusty mirror in the corner of the room. He looked at his reflection. What he saw was a man he barely recognized. A hollow face, a scruffy beard, deep-set eyes from years of hopelessness. He touched his face as if to make sure he was still real. I'm not that man anymore, Ethan, he murmured. Ethan stepped closer, watching him through the mirror. "Who says you can't be again?" Jonathan chuckled, a tired laugh. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not, but running isn't easy either." Jonathan looked away. Silence stretched between them. "What if I fail?" he whispered. Ethan sighed and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Then you try again." The afternoon settled over New York as Jonathan walked beside Ethan through the busy streets. For the first time in years, he wore clean clothes. Ethan had taken him to a barber shop, where he got a haircut and shaved his scruffy beard. When he looked in the mirror again, he saw something different. Not the professor he once was, but not the man who had given up either. He was someone in between, someone who still had a choice, and for the first time, Jonathan allowed himself to want to live. "Ready?" Ethan asked, looking at him. Jonathan took a deep breath and nodded. It was time to face the world, and this time, he wasn't going to run.